Imagine for a moment that everything you were ever told about divine truth was only a fraction of a far greater light, a light deliberately hidden from humanity. Think of the countless souls who searched for spiritual clarity, kneeling before altars, reading scriptures and praying for enlightenment, unaware that much of the original message of illumination was quietly buried beneath centuries of dogma and control. Today we will uncover what may be one of the greatest spiritual mysteries of all time, why the Church erased the true gospel of light, and what that means for those who still seek to awaken the divine spark within. Stay with me until the end, because the final revelation in this journey is the most powerful of all. Before we begin, if you are someone who feels drawn to explore hidden wisdom, to understand the truths that ancient mystics guarded and philosophers hinted at, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, share this video, and comment your thoughts. What you'll discover here could change the way you see reality, history, and even your own soul. Now, let's begin this descent into forgotten knowledge. For thousands of years, humanity has been told that salvation comes only through external authority, that truth must be mediated by an institution, a priest, or a sacred hierarchy. But what if the earliest followers of the Christ taught something entirely different? What if they believed that the kingdom of heaven was not in temples made by human hands, but within, a radiant presence of divine consciousness hidden inside each being? This, according to scholars like Elaine Pagels of Princeton University and Marvin Meyer, the translator of the Nag Hammadi scriptures, is precisely what the early mystical Christians believed. They followed not a doctrine of fear, but a path of Gnosis, a word meaning inner knowing. Their gospel of light, sometimes called the Gospel of Truth, Gospel of Thomas, or Gospel of Mary, spoke not of obedience, but of awakening. Yet these teachings posed a profound threat. If the divine spark dwells within, then no institution could claim monopoly over salvation. No priest could stand between a soul and the infinite. No empire could govern the inner kingdom. And so, as history reveals, the spiritual message that empowered the individual was gradually rewritten into one that empowered the hierarchy. By the 4th century, under Emperor Constantine, Christianity was no longer the faith of the persecuted. It became the religion of the empire. The Council of Nicaea in the year 325 did not simply debate theology. It determined which truths would be canonized and which would be condemned. Texts that emphasized divine knowledge and the light within were branded heresy and systematically destroyed. The Gnostic Gospels were buried in the deserts of Egypt, hidden by monks who feared for their lives, and remained lost for more than 1,600 years. Think about that. Entire spiritual traditions erased from collective memory, only to be rediscovered in 1945, as if the sands of time themselves decided it was finally time for humanity to remember. But why would the Church, an institution claiming to represent the light, seek to suppress it? To answer that, we must look beyond politics and theology into the psychology of power. When people discover the light within, they become ungovernable by fear. They no longer need intermediaries to access the divine. They begin to see themselves as living temples of spirit, as co-creators of reality. And throughout history, those who sought control have always feared the liberated mind. The true gospel of light taught that every human being carries within them a divine spark, a fragment of the eternal source. The Christ, according to these mystical texts, did not come to found a religion, but to remind humanity of its forgotten divinity. Salvation, they said, is not granted, it is remembered. Now pause for a moment and reflect. How would your life change if you truly believed that the same divine force that spoke through the prophets and enlightened the sages burns within you even now? Would you live differently? Would you still seek permission to shine? Many have wondered whether this was the ultimate message, hidden beneath the layers of doctrine, that the true light of Christ was never meant to be worshipped externally, but awakened internally. The words of the Gospel of Thomas echo through the ages. The kingdom is inside of you and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will realize that you are the children of the living Father. This is the truth that frightened empires, a truth that could not be owned, taxed, or ruled, a truth that belonged to the heart of every human being. And that is where our exploration truly begins. Because in the next part, we will uncover how this gospel of light survived in secret, preserved through symbols, mystery schools, and initiations, waiting for a time when the human spirit would be ready to reclaim its hidden inheritance. The sands of Egypt concealed more than lost scrolls. They concealed an unbroken current of wisdom that refused to die. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in 1945 was not an accident. It was synchronicity. Hidden inside clay jars near the Nile lay texts that the world was never meant to read, writings that spoke of an eternal light, a divine essence flowing through all creation. These were not the words of rebels or heretics, but of those who remembered. Among those scriptures was the Gospel of Thomas, a text unlike any in the canonical Bible. It contained no miracles, no crucifixion, no resurrection story, only sayings attributed to Jesus that spoke directly to the heart of consciousness. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you, it says. This single line shattered centuries of dogmatic interpretation because it pointed to salvation not as a transaction, but as an awakening. Yet the Church Fathers could not allow such a message to spread. For them, spiritual autonomy threatened the order of empire. So the gospel of illumination became the gospel of obedience. Instead of awakening, faith was replaced by fear. Instead of direct communion, the masses were taught submission. The radiant message of self-realization was buried beneath the weight of ritual, authority, and guilt. But the light was never fully extinguished. It simply changed form. The same flame that burned in the hearts of the early mystics reappeared in the secret teachings of the Hermetic philosophers, in the silent meditations of desert monks, and in the whispered symbols of the alchemists. Even when the outer church condemned them, these seekers kept the current alive. Think of the Hermetic principle as above, so below, as within, so without. It echoes the same truth as the gospel of light, that the universe is mirrored inside each soul, and that divine creation is a reflection of inner consciousness. The Gospel of Mary spoke the same message, teaching that the Savior's true instruction was to find freedom through inner understanding, not through external authority. Imagine how different history might have been if this knowledge had remained in plain sight. Humanity might have evolved toward cooperation instead of conquest, unity instead of division. But when knowledge is hidden, it becomes power for the few. By obscuring the truth, institutions gained control over both the body and the spirit. Through confession, they claimed the conscience. Through ritual, they claimed devotion. And through fear of damnation, they claimed obedience. Yet history shows that suppression cannot silence truth forever. From the Cathars of medieval France, who taught that divine light resided in all beings, to the mystics of the Renaissance who revived Hermetic wisdom under the guise of philosophy, the same current kept resurfacing. Scholars such as Carl Jung recognized these rediscovered Gospels as symbolic maps of inner transformation. He wrote that the light within, once repressed, inevitably seeks to emerge again in the collective psyche. So perhaps what we call heresy was never rebellion against God, but rebellion against ignorance. The heretics of history were the visionaries who refused to surrender the idea that enlightenment is a birthright. Pause for a moment and ask yourself, what if you had lived in an age when reading a sacred text outside the church's approval meant imprisonment or death? Would you have hidden your truth? Would you have buried your gospel in the earth, trusting that one day someone like you would uncover it? Every soul that safeguarded the light did so for a future generation, a generation that could read freely, think freely, and remember freely. That generation is ours. The Gospel of Light teaches that the divine does not dwell in distant heavens, but vibrates in every atom of existence, every thought of compassion, every act of creation, every moment of awareness brings that light into form. The Christ, then, becomes not a single historical figure, but a universal consciousness, the spark of divine awareness within all beings. This is what the early mystics knew, and it is precisely what power sought to erase: the knowledge that humanity and divinity are one. But the story does not end here. For although the outer church built cathedrals of stone, the inner church of the Temple of Light continued to live in secret schools and esoteric brotherhoods. The Rosicrucians, the alchemists, and later the mystics of the Renaissance carried the same eternal flame under new names. They encoded their truths in symbols: the rose and the cross, the philosopher's stone, the all-seeing eye, all reminders of the hidden light within. The church might have burned their books, but symbols cannot be destroyed. They reappear in art, architecture, and myth, whispering the same message to those with eyes to see. And that brings us to the next revelation. In the following part, we will uncover how these secret traditions preserved the true gospel of light through codes, geometry, and sacred art, and how, even today, its wisdom still calls to those ready to awaken. The secret traditions that guarded the gospel of light did not fight the church directly. They knew that open defiance would lead only to destruction. Instead, they chose a wiser path, the path of symbols, of hidden knowledge disguised in plain sight. In art, in architecture, in sacred geometry, they wove a silent language that only the awakened could read. When you walk into an ancient cathedral, you might think you are entering a monument to religious authority. But look deeper. The rose windows are mandalas of cosmic harmony. The labyrinths carved into the stone floors mirror the inner journey of the soul. The very structure of these buildings encodes the Hermetic truth that God geometrizes. The outer church, without realizing it, became the custodian of the very mysteries it tried to erase. The initiates of light, the alchemists, the Kabbalists, the mystics, continued the ancient work of remembrance. They taught that transformation begins not with belief, but with inner fire. To transmute lead into gold was never about metal, it was about the soul's awakening from ignorance to illumination. In the Emerald Tablet, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, we read, "That which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below." These words are the echo of the same truth once spoken by the Christ of the Gnostics, that the divine kingdom is within and without, inseparable. But why were these truths hidden in the first place? Because every age of darkness fears its dawn. Throughout history, those who controlled knowledge controlled destiny. The early church understood that whoever defined truth defined power. By erasing the inner gospel, it ensured that people would forever seek salvation outside themselves, dependent, obedient, and blind to the light within. Yet, generation after generation, small circles of seekers refused to forget. The Cathars called themselves the Pure Ones and believed that the visible world was a shadow of the true world of light. The Templars, before their fall, carried symbols of the inner fire and studied ancient teachings from the East. The Rosicrucians of the 17th century spoke of a secret fraternity devoted to spiritual and scientific enlightenment, the fusion of wisdom and light. All these movements were sparks from the same eternal flame. They appeared, were persecuted, and disappeared, only to rise again in another form in another century. The light cannot be destroyed. It can only be hidden until hearts are ready to perceive it. Think of Leonardo da Vinci. His art is filled with coded geometry, golden ratios, and layers of esoteric symbolism. Or consider the great cathedrals of Europe. Beneath their Gothic arches, you can feel not only devotion, but design, the attempt to translate divine harmony into form. The builders may have served the church, but the geometry they used served the light. Even in the darkest times, poets and mystics whispered fragments of the forbidden message. Meister Eckhart, the German theologian of the 13th century, dared to say, "The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me." For such words, he was accused of heresy. Yet his insight mirrored the gospel of light exactly, that the divine and the human are reflections of one another, the same flame seen from two perspectives. What then does this mean for us today? It means that the gospel of light was never truly lost. It lives within the very structure of our culture, hidden in myths, symbols, and even language. Every story of resurrection, every tale of transformation, every image of light overcoming darkness, all are echoes of this ancient memory. But now, the cycle turns again. Humanity is entering an age where hidden knowledge is re-emerging, where science and spirituality begin to meet, where the veil between matter and consciousness grows thinner. The rediscovery of the Gnostic texts, the global fascination with sacred geometry, the resurgence of interest in ancient wisdom, all are signs that the light is rising once more. Pause and think. What if the purpose of all these rediscoveries is not merely academic but spiritual? What if this is the moment when humanity is meant to remember who it truly is? The church may have erased words from parchment, but it could never erase truth from the soul. The gospel of light was written in the stars, in the rhythm of nature, in the conscience of every awakened heart. To read it, one does not need permission, only awareness. In the next part, we will reach the heart of this revelation. We will uncover what the true gospel of light actually teaches about the nature of reality, the purpose of the soul, and how each of us can reignite the divine flame within. And the final truth, the one hidden since the dawn of time, will reveal why the light could never be destroyed and why its return now changes everything. Light cannot be destroyed. It only waits for the eyes that can see it. The Gospel of Light was never a book bound in leather or inked on parchment. It was a living message, a vibration of consciousness whispered from soul to soul across the ages. Every mystic, every poet, every scientist who looked at the universe with wonder has heard its silent call. Awaken, for you are not separate from the source. You are its expression. According to the ancient texts found at Nag Hammadi, the true teaching of the Christ was not a command to believe, but an invitation to remember. Humanity fell not from grace, but from awareness. The so-called fall was the forgetting of our divine origin, the descent of consciousness into matter, the soul's dream of separation. The return to the light, then, is not a redemption purchased through suffering, but a remembrance awakened through insight. The Gospel of Light declares that creation itself is an act of love, the infinite expressing itself in countless forms so that it might come to know its own beauty. When the Christ spoke of the Father and the kingdom, he was not pointing to a distant realm in the sky. He was revealing the truth that the divine presence breathes within every heartbeat, every atom, every moment of awareness. This is the message the early church feared, for it rendered all intermediaries unnecessary. A person who knows that God dwells within cannot be ruled through guilt or fear. Such a person becomes a sovereign soul, free, luminous, compassionate, and ungovernable. And so the Gospel of Light was branded heresy, its followers silenced. But the truth remained, pulsing quietly in the human heart, waiting for a new age of awakening. Today, that awakening has begun. The boundaries between science and spirituality are dissolving. Quantum physics now speaks of fields of light, of energy and consciousness woven into the fabric of reality, echoes of what the ancients already knew. The mystics called it the divine light. Physicists call it the quantum field. Both describe the same eternal truth. Everything is connected, and consciousness is the essence of all. Think of how profound that realization is. You are not a separate being moving through an indifferent universe. You are the universe experiencing itself through the miracle of your awareness. The same creative force that ignited the stars flows through your thoughts, your breath, your will. The Gospel of Light calls this the Christ within. Not a name, but a state of consciousness that remembers unity. This is why the Church's suppression of the inner gospel was never the end of the story. The light cannot be monopolized. Every time someone chooses love over fear, awareness over ignorance, truth over comfort, the Gospel of Light is preached anew. No pulpit, no ritual, no doctrine required. Only the courage to see the divine in oneself and in all. Pause for a moment and feel that truth. The same eternal essence that moved through the prophets, sages, and saints breathes in you now. You are the continuation of the cosmic story. You are the page upon which the universe writes its revelation. This realization is not arrogance, it is humility before the infinite. For when you truly see the light within, you see it in everyone. Judgment dissolves, division collapses. Compassion becomes natural because you recognize yourself in all beings. This was the true gospel, not a religion but a remembrance of unity. And so the question arises, why did the Church erase it? Perhaps because it knew that once people awakened to the light within, the world would change forever. Hierarchies would crumble, control would vanish. The temples of stone would no longer be needed, for every heart would become a sanctuary of the divine. But that moment is returning. Across the world, millions are rediscovering ancient wisdom, meditating, seeking meaning beyond material existence. The Gospel of Light is rising again, not as rebellion, but as renewal. It whispers through synchronicities, through acts of kindness, through the quiet certainty that there is more to life than we've been told. So, if you've listened this far, consider this not just a story about history, but a call to remembrance. The light that the Church tried to erase has always been within you. You do not need permission to awaken. You do not need intermediaries to reach the divine. The temple is your consciousness, and the altar is your heart. The final revelation, the one promised at the beginning, is simple yet world-shattering. You are the gospel of light. Every moment you choose awareness over ignorance, love over fear, unity over separation, you restore what was lost. The true Christ is the light of consciousness, shining through you, through me, through all existence. The gospel of light was never destroyed because it was never outside of us. It lives in the pulse of creation, waiting for us to remember. And now, perhaps, after centuries of forgetting, humanity is ready to see once more. So look within, listen deeply. The light has always been speaking your name. Thanks for looking.